Hello, this is Cynthia Mccallister. This lecture is developed to give you an initial introduction to the learning cultures model. It will also place formal education traditions within a larger historical context so that we can see more clearly the reasons why our existing systems of schooling need to be changed. So, what is learning cultures? Well, the model is designed to be a blueprint that educators can follow to restructure classrooms, schools, and informal learning contexts. The blueprint specifies a set of practices that are organized to allow students to assume greater levels of responsibility for learning than has been the case in traditional classrooms. The learning cultures model is organized around classroom and whole school systems. So classroom systems reorganize the traditional teacher-directed environment into buzzing pods of student-directed activity. This student-directed activity is achieved through a system of structures known as learning formats. Learning formats are based on familiar classroom activities, like small group reading instruction, whole class lessons, or independent work, but these seemingly familiar activities are rewired in the learning cultures model in order to maximize student autonomy, engagement, responsibility for learning, cooperation, and collaboration with others. The formats specify rules, roles, and responsibilities for both students and teachers. They're highly organized and recurrent. Because they happen on a predictable and frequent basis, they organize classroom life so students learn to anticipate the need to always be independent, cooperative, active, and critical in their thinking. The formats are designed to accommodate a full range of learning aims, so they can be adapted to any age level or subject area. The format procedures are specified in a set of rubrics that teachers, students, and school leaders use as tools to norm social practices in their communities. The formats are closely aligned with formal learning standards, so the choices that students make about the activities they will engage in result in their high achievement of learning standards. The formats are also closely aligned to high standards for teacher effectiveness. That means that fidelity of implementation on the teacher's part results in high levels of effective practice. So school-wide structures. The school-wide system is organized around 5 broad projects, including number 1, progress monitoring and assessment, number 2, curriculum, number 3, professional development, number 4, school culture and discipline, and number 5, a program to support low or non-progressing students. Each of these projects are led by a teacher lead. These teacher leads are responsible for implementing the project agenda. In some schools, leads guide a group of teachers who serve as a project team and support the work. This organizational system provides a structure of sufficient distributed leadership. This means that the pressure of successful implementation doesn't rest on the shoulders of one person, the principal or headmaster, and the distributed leadership helps support cohesive and high-fidelity implementation of the learning cultures model across a whole school. You may be thinking to yourself, this learning cultures approach seems like a big shift, and that little voice of doubt inside your head might be reasoning, doesn't the system work well enough the way it is? Why would a teacher or school want to implement learning cultures? Here are a number of responses to that question. First, there's been a consensus for at least a half a century that our schools are broken to a degree. Schools as we know them developed to meet the needs of society for bygone times, when boys were destined to work as adults in factories or on farms, and women were for the most part going to work in the home. Only basic math and reading skills were necessary for the futures anticipated by students of the past. But society has changed vastly since the public education system became commonplace in developed countries in the early 20th century. So schools need to change in order to equip people for a new future. Second, learning cultures is based on the idea that learning emerges from participation in social practices as opposed to the process of simple transmission from teacher to student, which is the logic that traditional school systems are based on. In fact, in learning cultures, social practices are seen to be every bit as consequential to learning as the content of the information that is transmitted. So, learning cultures works from a different logic than traditional teacher-directed linear curriculum models. It organizes the classroom around a set of specific practices that embed learning content. These practices delineate the routines and responsibilities that kids and teachers should assume. Third, the architectural structures of school are built upon problematic assumptions about knowledge, authority, and control. These structures force patterns of activity in classrooms that honor old-fashioned ways of thinking about learning and knowledge and prevent new forms of activity. The structure of school has antecedents in the history of architecture. Jeremy Bentham, a social philosopher of the 18th century, developed an institutional design called the Panopticon. The word Panopticon means view of all. Originally designed as a prison, it was a circular structure with an observation post at the center and cells built on the periphery, enabling a single guard to observe and monitor all inmates. This architectural technology became, in current-day vernacular, all the rage in 18th century institutional architecture because it was considered efficient. One guard could monitor all of the inmates. And because efficiency was highly valued in social institutions that were growing rapidly to accommodate the needs of fast-growing and increasingly complex towns and cities, these principles were applied to building designs of other institutions, like schools and hospitals. The French philosopher Michel Foucault points out that the very bricks and mortar structure of most schools, like prisons, enables the eye of authority to efficiently observe, monitor, and exert control over students. In his book, Discipline and Punishment, Foucault writes that, within the structure of the panopticon in the prison, the inmate is, quote, the object of information, never a subject in communication. The same could be said for schools. At the time, students were viewed in the same way, as blank slates waiting to receive information. The student was the recipient of directives, never a co-participant in dialogue. At that time, when schools were designed and built on a large scale, social interaction was viewed as an impediment to efficient learning. Children were to be seen, not heard. When organized in this manner, as Foucault points out, schools are seen as efficient because there is no noise, no chatter, no copying or wasting of time. The logic of the organization of school as a panopticon is based on efficiency of distribution of information and management of student behavior. But control is no longer a suitable way of thinking about successful teaching and learning interactions. Successful learning is now understood to be social and relational in nature, and above all, self-initiated. It hardly matters what a teacher is transmitting if that spark of agency and intention inside the student is shut down to the possibility of new learning. We now understand that if social interaction and student intentionality are of critical medium of learning, structures and systems that prevent interaction and student agency are ultimately inefficient due to the way they impede learning. What is needed for schools of today is a structural organization more conducive to social interchange and supportive of student intentionality. But our schooling traditions go back beyond the 18th century panopticon. Classroom ways of life in modern schools are the product of historically and culturally rooted social practices that some scholars argue go back at least 4,000 years to the time when ancient societies sought to systematically transfer knowledge from one generation to the next. A common assumption dating back to this time, and one that persists today, is that teachers hold knowledge and use their authority in the classroom to impart knowledge to students by teaching or telling. So, dating back several millennia, formal schooling situations were organized by a hierarchy of authority. This is a photograph of an excavation of an early classroom from Michael Cole's article, Cross-Cultural and Historical Perspectives on Developmental Consequences of Education. Take a minute to mentally describe the features of this setting. Think how these features might have influenced the interactions between students and teachers at the time. Contemplate for a minute the assumptions held by these ancient people about what knowledge is and how it is acquired. Pause the lecture to jot a few notes or discuss your response to these questions. Now look at a few images of modern classrooms from a wide range of modern cultures. What do these images share in common with the image of Sumerian classrooms? What assumptions do you think have remained consistent throughout the millennia about what knowledge is and how it's acquired? Despite lingering assumptions about knowledge and learning, scientific and philosophical ideas have developed significantly over these thousands of years. We know learning isn't based on the simple transfer of knowledge. But modern classrooms around the world are still physically organized to position the teacher at the head of the classroom as the locus of knowledge transmission. The teacher is still at the head of the classroom and students are spectators. Students listen, watch, observe, but their active participation is limited to hand raising and responding to teacher directives. In many ways, these classrooms teach obedience, or at least obedience is a precondition to active participation. Some kids actively participate, but others don't. This image represents a traditional classroom structure where the teacher is the authority and dispenser of knowledge. But even ahead of the teacher is the principal or headmaster who controls the teachers and the students through structures of supervision and observation. Some of their authority is channeled to teachers who have authority over students and responsibility not only to pass on knowledge, but also to control behavior. The principal also typically hands off some authority to other leaders who are expected to address the needs of students who are not able to be successful in the regular classroom setting. The old-fashioned term, to toe the line, originates from the classroom where students were expected to line up, literally, for roll call, standing with their toes on a line on the floor. Kids who can't toe the line, in a metaphorical sense, are pulled offline, where their needs are addressed by out-of-classroom teachers and disciplinarians. For example, kids who fall behind academically are pulled offline and provided different interventions. Kids who can't behave are pulled offline and sent to the dean. Kids who have personal or emotional challenges are pulled offline to work with counselors. Kids who don't speak the language of the classroom are pulled offline to work with language teachers. Don't get me wrong. The motives for these pull-out programs are laudable, but the underlying assumptions these programs are based on is deeply flawed. They assume that large groups of humans can be convened and provided an average dose of instructional treatment. For most members of the group, this normal dose will be adequate to promote learning. But it's also assumed, even accepted, that the normal treatment won't work for some kids with special or more particular needs. By its very structure, this system operationalizes a process by which some kids are constructed as abnormal, and systems that produce or manufacture abnormality essentially produce a whole range of problems for themselves that can never be resolved. Learning cultures provides a way to restructure ancient classroom systems. Kids are not subjected to arbitrary labels of high or low, normal or abnormal. Rather, each individual joins the group on equal terms, where his or her individual needs are met and where she or he learns to participate in socially sanctioned, conventionalized, or normal ways of being. This image represents the structure of a learning culture classroom, in which relational configurations distribute responsibility and authority to students themselves through opportunities to exercise freedom and autonomy and work cooperatively in the formats. Teachers monitor and facilitate student-centered activities. Through these activities, students have opportunity to develop agency and independence in learning while also developing motivation and stronger learning intentions. But they also have an opportunity to develop multiple relationships, and these relationships are the pathways along which knowledge is transmitted. The environments must support a classroom culture that provides opportunities for students to actively engage with their peers through perspective shifting and intention sharing in order to reach learning targets. Existing historically and culturally inherited forms of life that cast teachers as purveyors of knowledge and students as passive recipients are obstacles to achievement of more literate and higher order modes of thinking, such as logical reasoning, critical questioning, inferring, and synthesizing ideas. ways of thinking akin to those delineated in new high learning standards. In other words, substantive reform of our ancient education systems requires us to alter classroom social practices to support the forms of thought and action that support literacy. The learning cultures model takes these ideas into account. Social context is an important facet of the curriculum, and it is assumed that in order to maximize student learning, teachers have to be diligent in developing positive social norms in the classroom. This is why learning cultures provides a strategy for teachers to develop positive social norms. When students entertain beliefs about themselves as being capable, and when they have harmonious relationships with others, whom they view as resources for learning and support, they will experience high levels of achievement across the board. So, our history has provided us a legacy of a structure for school that is outdated. That's one reason schools should change. But the last half century has ushered in a broad-based school reform movement that is inspired by other reasons for change. Virtually every country in the world is now seeking to reform its formal education system. These initiatives are motivated for a variety of reasons, including economic and national security, among others. In the U.S., reforms were triggered by a number of factors and events, notably Sputnik and the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Both of these events were seen by the public as a wake-up call to improve the quality of education as a means to ensure greater prosperity and the United States' preeminence as a global power. In the last 5 decades, reform has taken many forms. These include legal remedies, such as desegregation and the Americans with Disabilities Act, among others, curriculum reform and huge investments in education, research, infrastructure, and systems reform have been made in the United States to support the cause of educational improvement. There has been progress, but advances made in other fields and disciplines far outpace those in education. For example, since the 1970s, fields in the behavioral sciences have produced new, revolutionary, and potentially impactful insights about human learning and thinking that should have caused substantive change in education processes. But these advances have not made their way into schools in any substantive way. Schools continue to function on antiquated systems that fail to utilize new knowledge to transform practices. This problem can be detected in our achievement trends. While there have been slight increases at the elementary and middle school level in reading comprehension, as measured by the National Assessment of Education Progress since the 1970s, there have been no significant improvements at the secondary level. And in the almost half century since the national patterns of achievement have been documented, comprehension rates of United States students have not increased more than 0.5 percentage point at any grade level. In 50 years, less than 0.5% on measures of reading comprehension. Our society is not successfully transmitting knowledge to new generations. And lagging literacy skills are not just a national problem, but a global one. Since the middle of the last century, education has been viewed as a human right. The United Nations spearheaded efforts to protect this right through a wide range of global education initiatives. And while progress has been made, many nations lag considerably in literacy rates, especially for girls and women. And education is made more of a challenge with new advances in information technology. While creation and availability of information is exploding at an exponential rate, the slow pace of educational improvement means that the system of formal schooling isn't keeping pace with advancing technology. Google CEO Eric Schmidt noted that we create as much information in 2 days as was created from the dawn of civilization to the year 2003. In the context of this information explosion, the fact that students barely demonstrate measurable progress in reading comprehension over the last 50 years creates a crisis in education. Communities around the world are all now experiencing escalating pressure to find more effective ways to provide access to education for all people of all ages in order to foster social stability, peace, and prosperity. Learning cultures attempts to respond to this challenge.